The Washington Post reports President Obama, on January 25, 2016, announced a ban on solitary confinement for juvenile offenders in the federal prison system, saying the practice is overused and has the potential for devastating psychological consequences. Obama also plans to ban solitary confinement as a response to low-level infractions, expand treatment for the mentally ill, and increase the amount of time inmates in solitary can spend outside of their cells. Interestingly, Amy Fettig, Senior Staff Counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union and director of the group's Stop Solitary campaign, stated, "We rarely have presidents take notice of prison conditions." Okay, so why has Obama taken notice? Well, my guess is that a discourse about solitary confinement in prisons has given rise to a particular public, and one big enough to attract the president's attention. According to a PBS documentary, solitary confinement began in America in the 1800s as a progressive experiment to see if isolation would reform criminals. It was soon largely abandoned because prisoners didn't reform. They lost their minds. But in the 1980s, solitary re-emerged as a way to stamp out prison violence. Well, that and because of rehabilitation cuts and because the prisons were overcrowded. Researchers have documented apparent symptoms of solitary confinement in prisoners, which include extreme anxiety, anger, hallucinations, mood swings and flatness, and loss of impulse control. In the absence of stimuli, prisoners may also become hypersensitive to any stimuli at all. Often they obsess uncontrollably, as if their minds didn't belong to them, over tiny details or personal grievances. Panic attacks are routine, as is depression and loss of memory and cognitive function. The Post states an increasing number of studies show a connection between isolating prisoners and higher rates of recidivism. Don't gloss over the word connection. To put into scientific terms, this means correlation, and correlations, no matter how strong, can never prove a cause and effect relationship, even in the case of solitary confinement, where the evidence seems convincing. Some prison officers warn of inmates trying manipulation, faking mental illness, to get themselves out of solitary. Still, other people argue that inmates who are already predisposed to mental illness wind up in solitary. Despite the controversy, the overall public opinion towards inmates in solitary confinement seems to have shifted dramatically. The public awareness may have been caught by research findings, but its continued attention appears to be motivated through a changed representation of the inmates in public discourse, which evolved simultaneously with the publication of research. In 2005, the television series Prison Break aired its first season. It was originally planned for a 13-episode run, but was so popular that it extended the season to include an extra 9 episodes. The series often depicted corrupt prison officers who would throw especially unruly inmates into solitary confinement, a miserable dank cell with no lights. While this portrayal is somewhat unrealistic, inmates in solitary actually have said the lights stay on too long. The dramatic shadows and dirty walls depicts the treatment of prisoners as something harkening back to the Dark Ages. Of course, Prison Break wasn't the first prison-themed TV drama. Many others had come before and after, including Porridge, Oz, Breakout Kings, Wentworth Prison, and Orange is the New Black. But let's turn back to Prison Break, shall we? The actors' representation of prison inmates occurred not just on, but off the set as well. Robert Knepper, who plays T-Bag, one of Prison Break's most despicable characters, offers his own thoughts.
Many different sides to that character. Same as with Billy Grimm and the actor that I play, Roger Reeves, who plays Billy Grimm.
Is I don't think there's not one character that has committed a violent act that wasn't justified. And you may think that's weird and funny, but for me, T-Bag is he's not a guy who just goes out and kills people. He only kills people because he wants to stay alive. It's a self-preservation thing. And at the same time, you have great heroes and you have great villains, and you get to see in this show, in this script, a whole other side to these villains that a lot of other shows never explore. Is what made these character villains? What made these guys bad guys? What happened in their childhood?
In both videos, Knepper draws attention to the humanity of the inmates and challenges stereotypical, non-nuanced conceptions of them. Robert Asen, a public theorist, states that our attitude toward and treatment of others depends crucially on how we imagine others, and representations express our collective imagination. In the comments section of a YouTube video about the apparent effects of solitary confinement on inmates, a few people expressed an uncompromising viewpoint of prisoners. Notice how their imaginations, and thus representations of prisoners, affect their subsequent judgment. Basically, if you can reduce and define a person by just the bad stuff they've done, it's pretty easy to eliminate all thoughts of mercy. In contrast, a group of activists and artists represented inmates in quite a different light through an art project entitled Photo Request from Solitary, in which prisoners could get a glimpse of the outside world through a single photograph of anything they desired. Inmates requested photos of themselves superimposed against particular backdrops, heroes' interests and dreams, recreated memories in old neighborhoods, and any imagined or fantastic scene. In this Huffington Post article, the journalist asked Lori Jo Reynolds, one of the leading artists involved with the project, whether she noticed any changes as a result of the project. Note the latter part of Reynolds' response. You do start to realize there's a person with consciousness in a box, and they are thinking and remembering and hoping, and they have memories and families and desires. It opens people up the issue in a way they're not used to. Way to nail the issue spot on, Lori Jo. The photos represented the prisoners in a way that an audience could identify with. In other words, the photos humanized the prisoners, a technique which resists a public's cursory condemnation and neglect. But get this, the group that created Photo Request from Solitary is called TAMS Year 10, and their campaigning eventually helped close the TAMS Supermax prison in Illinois the year 2013 after it was deemed counterproductive and dehumanizing. Who knew that a little reimagining and re-representation could lead to such drastic results? Up to this point, inmates mainly relied on others to represent them in public discourse. But in 2014, with the creation of the Prison Writers website, inmates had an opportunity to contribute to public discourse and to represent themselves. One contributor named Jose wrote an article titled Solitary Confinement, All That's Left to Do is Go Crazy. He also uses reimagining, humanizing, and identification techniques to create a positive rhetorical impact on the reader. For example, he writes, "To me, solitary is like dreaming of swimming in a sea of red-hot coals where you feel the scorching ember pierce and burn through your skin. You hear your own voice screaming in pain, only to wake up from the nightmare and find that although your body is free from scars, your mind felt the excruciating pain. This is solitary, only it continues for months, years, and decades." Even in this small excerpt, Jose forces us as readers to engage in active imagination, put ourselves in his place, and thus identify with him, all with the simple word you. Jose strengthens this reader audience identification and humanizes himself with the word we. One of the things about human beings that is special is that no matter what we are up against, and regardless of the challenges we face, we will find ways to struggle against injustice. We are compelled to live another day. We are driven to better our conditions. Even within the darkest, most barbaric solitary cell in the U.S., people can be found struggling in so many creative ways in order to stay sane, to stay alive. Another prison writer contributor named Brad uses a technique I haven't explicitly mentioned yet, inciting a matter of concern to the dominant public. He begins his piece stating, "Hello, my name is Brad, but everyone calls me Lou. I'm in prison for killing an inmate while doing time for another crime. The reason I tell you this is so you'll know upfront that I'm not innocent. I'm not wrongfully convicted or targeted. This article isn't about me crying over my situation because I feel I created mine." Brad goes on, however, to talk about his negative experience in solitary. He concludes by saying, "Think about it. Can you honestly say you could do over a dozen years of this solitary life and still be normal? Survive the sterile torture of being left to yourself? If you're honest, I bet 85% of you would say no. So think about that for a minute. Maybe you could help someone out there deal with it. It could be as simple as a word of encouragement or an inspiring letter. Everyone needs to feel like someone cares and that he or she is worth something to someone. It is a fact I will be released." I don't know about you, but that last line gave me goosebumps. Public rhetorician Nancy Fraser states, "What will count as a matter of common concern will be decided precisely through discursive contestation." In one respect, Brad introduces solitary confinement as a new matter for common concern, but he does so by appealing to an underlying, already established public concern, that of safety and security. Okay, time for a quick recap. What are some of the main rhetorical moves this counterpublic has made in its discourse to elicit the attention and support of members from a dominant public? Well, technique number 1 uses reimagination by way of humanization, which leads to changed representation and thus audience identification with the subject. Confused? Maybe it's better to stick with technique number 2, which is simply introducing and appealing to a common concern of the dominant public. Just how effective are these techniques for a counterpublic? I'd say pretty effective, especially considering that the President of the United States used these very moves in his op-ed for the Washington Post. Obama first describes the case of Khalif Browder, who was sent to prison in 2010, spent 2 of 3 years in solitary confinement, released in 2013, and committed suicide in 2015, reportedly from irrecoverable psychological damage inflicted by solitary confinement. Representation and humanization at work here. Here's another snippet that demonstrates the use of appeal to common concern. Note the phrases like, the United States is a nation of second chances, and keep the American people safe. Safety is a common concern, but how is the U.S. is a nation of second chances a common concern? Well, I don't have time to go into great detail, but second chances is an ideology or ideograph, which really becomes a type of common concern as people strive to uphold that ideograph. Okay, moving on. Take another look at this excerpt. Obama writes, those who do make it out of solitary prison often have trouble holding down jobs, reuniting with family, and becoming productive members of society. Imagine having served your time and then being unable to hand change over to a customer or look your wife in the eye or hug your children. Another prime example of reimagination. I can go through Obama's entire article and point out different rhetorical moves, but I'm not going to. And I also have a confession to make. You know the 2 rhetorical techniques I said this particular counterpublic makes? They're actually 2 of numerous rhetorical moves the counterpublic uses. I just happen to emphasize these 2. But I would submit to you that all of those rhetorical moves overlap in intricate ways, and they overlap because they stem from one underlying principle, the appeal to pathos. The authors of Rhetoric and Civic Life claim that, to convince another person of an idea, purely rational and objective argument is not enough because communication occurs through language that has judgments embedded within it. Basically, language is pathetic by nature, not pitiful like wet cat in the rain pathetic, but pathetic in the rhetorical sense, relating to emotions. What's underneath emotion is an expression of values, and we make judgments based on values. Try testing this idea out against a rhetorical analysis of a public text and see if it holds water. I will end now on this food for thought. Perhaps the main work of counterpublics, in order to effect social change, is to adapt their aims to the values of the dominant public.